The wind whispered through the trees like a secret too big to keep. Leaves spun and danced in little circles on the forest floor, carried by a breeze that smelled faintly of ash and wild honey. Far beyond the sleepy village of Thistlewick, in a clearing where no paths led and maps turned blank, something stirred, something old, something watching. A squirrel froze mid-scamper. A robin, high in a silver birch, stopped singing and tilted its head. Even the grass bent a little lower, as though listening. In the center of the clearing, beneath a ring of mushroom caps and tangled roots, a stone glowed softly with orange cracks, as if fire lived inside. Then, with a soft hum and a puff of smoke, the stone shifted. A scale, green and gold and glittering, peeled back from the surface like the petal of a flower opening to morning sun. Another scale followed, and another, until two bright golden eyes blinked awake beneath the mossy earth. A growl, low and deep like thunder wrapped in velvet, rolled out from the ground. Birds burst from the trees in flurries. The wind turned colder, and then silence. Not far away, nestled in a crooked cottage at the edge of the woods, a girl named Elva stirred in her sleep. Her fingers twitched as though reaching for something in a dream. A tiny flame flickered in the fireplace, though the hearth had gone cold hours ago. By morning, the strange hush that had settled over Thistlewick would be broken. Chickens would squawk too loudly, dogs would bark at shadows. And Elva would wake to find the small silver pendant on her windowsill, the one shaped like a dragon's wing, was warm to the touch. Something was coming, and it would change everything. The morning sun spilled across the village rooftops like golden paint, but the people of Thistlewick felt none of its usual warmth. The baker burned his first loaf. The hens refused to lay, and when the cobbler's cat leapt high onto a roof beam, yowling as if it had seen a ghost, not even the bravest boys dared to laugh. Elva noticed it too. The way the sky seemed duller, the air heavier, the woods quieter. She sat on the edge of her small bed, fingers wrapped tightly around the dragon-wing pendant. It pulsed faintly in her palm, warm as a teacup left in the sun. Her heart beat faster. The pendant had belonged to her older brother, Rin, before he vanished last spring, lost in the forest during a thunderstorm, never found. The grown-ups had whispered. Some said wolves, others quicksand or the old well near the glade. But Elva never believed those stories, not for a moment. Rin was brave. Rin was strong. And most of all, Rin had promised her, the night before he disappeared, that he'd protect her no matter what, even if he had to become a dragon to do it. At the time, she had giggled and tucked the pendant under her pillow. Now, she wasn't so sure it had been a joke. Elva stood and tucked the pendant into her pocket, careful not to wake her sleeping mother. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet as she tiptoed to the door. Something tugged at her, not her hand, not her sleeve, but something deeper, like the wind itself calling her name. She followed it, past the garden gate, over the cobblestone bridge, into the woods that children were told never to enter alone. The trees closed in around her like tall, watchful giants, their branches swaying in a breeze that didn't reach the village. Her boots crunched on fallen leaves. Birds stayed silent. Elva's steps slowed near the old glade, the place where Rin had last been seen, but the clearing she remembered had changed. Where grass had once grown, now moss glimmered green and gold, soft as velvet underfoot. At its center stood a small hill of stones, crowned with mushrooms that glowed faintly, as if dusted with starlight. And rising from the hill was a single jagged rock, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Elva stepped closer. The pendant in her pocket burned brighter. Suddenly, a shape stirred behind the rock, massive, scaled, and curled like a sleeping cat. A tail, long and ringed in gold. A claw, sharp as crystal, twitching in a dream. And then, the head rising, stretching, unfolding, two glowing eyes blinked open and met hers. It was a dragon, but not a terrifying beast like the ones in storybooks. This creature was smaller, sleeker, with moss on its back and feathers along its spine. Its eyes weren't cruel or hungry, they were curious, almost familiar. Elva took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. The dragon tilted its head, and then, slowly, it lifted one claw and placed it gently on the glowing rock. The pendant leapt from her pocket. It flew through the air and snapped into the stone, lighting it like a lantern. The dragon let out a low hum, not a roar, but a sound like a song remembered, and the air around them shimmered. Smoke curled from the dragon's nose, its scales glowed, and then, before her eyes, it began to change. The tail shrank, the wings folded in, the claws turned to fingers, and where the dragon had stood, now stood a boy, tall, barefoot, and blinking like someone waking from a deep sleep. It was Rin. His eyes still held a faint glow, and fine golden scales shimmered on his arms. But it was him, her brother, alive, changed. And yet, still him. He stepped forward, but his legs wobbled, and he sank to his knees. Elva rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. His heart beat strong beneath her hands. As she helped him to sit, Rin placed his hand over the stone once more. Images swirled in its surface, like smoke flashes of stormy skies, the crash of lightning, the moment he had been struck down in the glade, and how the dragon's spirit, ancient and waiting, had entered him to save his life. But it had not been just a rescue, it was a binding. The forest had chosen him, a guardian, a protector of the wild things, a dragon, in spirit and soul. Rin had been trapped in the dragon form for a full season, learning the old ways, unable to return until someone brave enough came to find him, someone who carried his heart, his sister. Elva sat beside him as the images faded. Her fingers brushed his scaled wrist. He smiled weakly, then looked toward the deeper woods. Something stirred in the shadows. Rin's smile faded. The forest had changed. A darkness had crept in. A creature, once sealed away by dragonfire, was waking, feeding on fear, stealing color and warmth from the world. That was why the birds had stopped singing, why the pendant had called out. Rin had felt it, even in his slumber. The seal was weakening. He could not fight alone. The dragon's power had grown quiet during his sleep. But there was still time. Still hope. Together, they could restore the seal. Elva felt her heart pound. She was no warrior. She had no sword or wings or magic breath. But Rin reached into the moss and pulled out a small, twisted root carved with runes. He placed it in her hand. It glowed faintly in her grip. The forest had chosen her too. They would journey to the Heart Hollow, the place where all forest paths led, but could not be found on a map. There, the seal could be remade. But the path would be long, and the shadows would try to turn them around. Elva looked at the glowing root, then at her brother's golden eyes. She nodded. They stood. As they stepped forward, the forest parted before them, the trees leaning gently aside, the moss lighting their way. Behind them, the stone glowed with quiet strength, like a promise waiting to be kept. Ahead, the deeper woods called, and somewhere, in the shadows, something stirred. The path to Heart Hollow was no ordinary trail. It twisted like a serpent's coil, folding back on itself, vanishing into mist, then appearing again behind gnarled roots and crooked stones. The trees whispered in voices that didn't belong to birds or wind, and shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't, yet the root in Elva's hand glowed steadily, tugging her forward like a lantern on a string. Rin followed beside her, quiet but alert, his golden eyes scanning the gloom. He no longer looked tired. The forest seemed to feed him, each step bringing more strength to his limbs. Fine scales shimmered along his arms and neck, flickering like sunlight on water. His breath sometimes curled into smoke, especially when fear crept near. But it was Elva who kept the pace, small boots crunching through frost-laced leaves, her grip on the rune root firm. She had never walked so far into the woods, never gone so deep into silence. It didn't last. The silence broke with a screech. It came from the treetops, sharp and wild, and before either of them could move, the sky darkened as wings unfolded above them. Not the wings of birds, these were leathery and huge, flapping with a gust that knocked Elva to her knees. A creature dove through the trees. Not quite beast, not quite shadow. Its body shimmered like fog, but its claws were real. It hissed with a sound like tearing cloth. Rin stepped in front of her. The shimmer returned to his arms. Flames licked at the corners of his mouth. But the creature didn't strike. Not yet. It hovered, circling them, its red eyes glowing. Then, like smoke poured into a shape, it stretched into the figure of a boy older than Rin, with tangled black hair and skin as pale as bone. His grin was wide and wrong, and when he stepped forward, the leaves beneath him shriveled. He had once been a guardian, too. The forest remembered him a boy, chosen long ago, who'd walked this same path with a rune root in hand, but he had given in to the whispers. He had let the shadow take root, trading his heart for power. Now he was bound to the darkness, a warden of the hollow, feeding on fear and turning lost souls into echoes. He pointed at Rin and laughed. Another fool, another forest pet pretending to be brave. Rin bared his teeth, a flash of dragon fang behind human lips. But the boy's eyes flicked to Elva. He spoke not in words, but in thought, sharp and cold, like frostbite. He told her she was nothing. A child, a tag-along. She held a glowing stick, and thought herself chosen. He dared her to walk alone, told her Rin would fail again, as he had once before, told her the forest would take her too. Elva's heart stuttered. For a breath, she almost believed him. But Rin turned, his gaze steady. And Elva remembered something, not magic, not runes, not dragons. She remembered a day when she was 5, when Rin had stood in front of a barking dog to shield her. She remembered how he made her laugh when she was sad, how he fixed her wooden bird when it broke, how he never, ever lied to her. She stood up. The rune root blazed in her hand. The shadow boy hissed, recoiling as though burned. The trees parted once more. The path was open. Elva stepped forward, not running, not flinching. Behind her, Rin rose, flames curling from his skin, and the shimmer of wings unfolded behind his shoulders. Together, they walked through the broken ring of trees. Heart Hollow was not a place, but a space. A vast, round clearing, empty of trees but filled with light that had no source. The ground was smooth and silver, like still water made solid. At its center stood a stone altar, cracked with age, circled by roots that pulsed like veins. The seal. It was broken. Where once light had flowed from the center, now darkness bled out. The roots had curled inward like claws. The forest's heart was leaking sorrow and cold. And above the altar, the shadow twisted like a storm. Not just one creature now, but many. Faces of wolves, wings of bats, eyes of all things lost and afraid. Rin stepped forward, raising his hands. Fire coiled around his fingers. But the shadow was faster. It struck with a scream of wind and ash. Rin met it with flame, but the impact threw him back. He rolled across the ground, groaning. Elva ran to him, dragging him behind a raised root. His eyes blinked weakly. He whispered with his gaze he couldn't do it alone. The seal needed more than fire. It needed love. Elva looked at the rune root in her palm. It glowed faintly still, warm like memory. She stepped out from the sheltering root and walked straight to the altar. The shadows screamed. They swirled toward her. But Elva held the root high. She thought not of fear, but of her brother's laughter, of the way he had sung her lullabies, of the warmth of their mother's arms, of every moment they had shared, the good, the hard, the small, and the beautiful. The root blazed like a sunrise. Light poured from it, not fire, but memory, warmth, love. It wrapped around the broken altar, crawling into the cracks, filling them like golden sap. The shadows screamed louder, shrinking back. Rin stood, his form shifting again taller now, wings wide and burning, his eyes full of dragonlight. He roared, a sound that shook the clearing, and his flames met the root's light. The seal mended. The altar glowed, and the shadows were no more. Not burned, not banished, but calmed, folded back into the roots of the forest, turned to soil and leaf and silence. The strange hush returned, but now it was peaceful, resting, whole. Rin landed beside Elva, his dragon form slowly fading. His scales shimmered once, then softened to skin. He reached for her hand, and she placed the root in his palm. It was cold now. Its work was done. They stood in the hollow, breathless, hands clasped. Behind them, the path home opened. The light in the heart hollow softened, settling like golden mist on Elva's shoulders. The wind, which had howled and twisted only moments before, now flowed gently through the trees, as if sighing in relief. All around them, the forest shifted. The roots that had pulsed with shadow now curled into the earth like sleeping vines. The ground beneath the altar shimmered once more, not with darkness, but with silver light, calm, still, and whole. Elva let go of her brother's hand and stepped slowly toward the heartstone, which still pulsed faintly beneath the surface. It was warm under her fingers, not burning like before, but steady, like the gentle beat of a lullaby. She looked back at Rin, and he gave a small nod. They had done it, but the forest was not finished with them yet. The ground stirred beneath their feet, not in fear, but in welcome. From the edge of the clearing, trees began to bend ever so slightly, their trunks leaning toward the heart of the hollow. Leaves unfurled where there had been bare branches. Flowers bloomed in patches of gold and blue, glowing softly. It was as though the woods themselves had woken from a bad dream. And from that blooming silence, figures emerged. Not human, not quite animal either, but something ancient and graceful, guardians of the forest. They stepped lightly from behind trees and out from shimmering bark. Some were tall and antlered like stags, others small and luminous like fireflies with legs. Their eyes shone with mossy green light, and their skin sparkled with bark and stars. They circled the children but did not speak. They simply bowed to Elva and then to Rin. The eldest of them, a towering being with moss in its beard and roots for fingers, approached. It placed a hand, gentle and wide as a branch, on Rin's shoulder. The forest would remember him, it said without words. He had been chosen, and he had chosen rightly. He had not fought for power, but for love. That was the oldest magic of all. Then the guardian turned to Elva, and the forest shimmered. It saw her too, not just as Rin's sister, not just as a child, but as something rare, a bridge. A soul with no magic of her own, yet full of strength and light. She had walked into darkness with nothing but memory and love. She had not fought with fire, she had healed with hope. A single leaf drifted from the sky, golden as dawn, and landed on her shoulder. It glowed once, then faded into her skin, leaving behind a faint shimmer, the mark of a bond. Not dragon, not guardian, something new. The path home opened once more, lit by moss and moonlight. The guardians bowed again, then melted back into the woods, as if they had never been there at all. Only the trees whispered now not warnings, but songs. The hollow had returned to peace. Rin and Elva walked side by side, the forest parting gently before them. The trees, once dark and tangled, now stood proud and straight. Birds had returned to the branches. Their songs were soft at first, then braver, brighter. Squirrels chattered from tree to tree. Even the air tasted sweet again. Elva looked up at her brother. His stride was steady, his face calm, but his golden eyes still gleamed beneath his lashes. The dragon was still there, not gone, just sleeping, waiting, should it ever be needed again. They reached the edge of the woods just as the first stars blinked into the evening sky. Thistlewick's lanterns flickered in windows below the hill. The village had not changed, the roofs were still crooked, the well still squeaked when drawn, but something inside Elva had shifted. She was not the same girl who had walked into the forest that morning. At their doorstep, their mother waited. Her hands trembled, and her apron was stained with flour she had forgotten to wipe away. When she saw them, she ran. She wrapped her arms around both children, pulling them close, not caring about dirt or leaves or the faint golden shimmer in Rin's eyes. She held them so tightly that Elva thought her heart might burst. That night, they sat by the fire. Rin told their mother only part of the tale, the safe parts, the kind you could speak out loud. Elva stayed quiet, fingers tracing the faint mark on her shoulder where the golden leaf had touched. She knew the forest would not want its deeper secrets shared. Some stories were meant to be kept like seeds, sleeping until they were needed. The days that followed returned slowly to normal, though they never felt quite the same. The hens laid again. The cobbler's cat purred instead of yowling. The sky grew bluer than Elva remembered it being. But in the woods, small things had changed. Flowers bloomed in places they hadn't before. Fireflies danced longer at night. And sometimes, just sometimes, children said they saw a golden-eyed fox watching from the edge of the trees, or heard a distant hum, like a dragon breathing. Elva still kept the pendant. It no longer glowed, but she wore it under her dress, close to her heart. The rune root had vanished from Rin's pocket one morning, crumbled into soil. Its magic returned to the forest, but Rin had not returned to the forest alone. He stayed. He chopped wood and fixed roofs and laughed again, though sometimes his gaze lingered on the trees longer than it used to. One night, as autumn winds returned and leaves painted the hills in orange and rust, Elva stood by the window. Rin joined her, taller now, stronger. He didn't speak, but she knew what he was thinking. The forest still watched them. Not as a danger, but as a friend. Elva thought of the seal, the shadows, the guardians. She thought of her own fear, and how it had not stopped her from stepping forward. She remembered the moment the root had blazed in her hand, not because of magic, but because of memory. The truth settled in her quietly. She hadn't saved the forest because she was brave. She had saved it because she loved. That was the lesson the woods had whispered all along. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to move forward, even when your hands shake, even when your heart trembles, even when the path is dark. And sometimes, that courage lives not in warriors or dragons, but in sisters who refuse to give up. Elva turned from the window. She took her brother's hand and squeezed it gently. Outside, somewhere deep in the trees, a soft flame flickered, and the dragon watched not to protect, but to remember. For love, once given, never fades.